You know what I run into a lot when researching stories for you guys? Cases that blew up thanks to the power of social media. I've talked about a couple cases that happened years ago but found fame again through TikTok and Instagram. And what do these cases have in common? Certain people on these platforms make comments about the criminals because they find them attractive. The case we're looking at today is a little different because instead of happening literal decades ago, this one only took place in 2020. It's pretty wild that people still choose to interact with criminals in this way, but we'll get more into that later. Let's dive into the case of Peter Manfredonia. Peter Manfredonia was a 23-year-old student at the University of Connecticut. According to a former classmate, user B_ writes, "No one would ever think of him as someone capable of any crime, let alone murder. He had friends, was on the football team, was smart and witty. When I first heard his name on the news, I couldn't believe it. I still can't." Peter grew up in Newtown, Connecticut. When he was a sophomore in high school, there was a deadly shooting at a nearby elementary school that claimed the lives of 26 students and staff members. In response to the attack, Peter helped raise money for the organizations that provided support and resources for those affected. So by all accounts, he seemed pretty normal. You could even call him a good guy. So what changed? What happened to turn him into the Peter we're looking at today? Well, during his time in college, it looked as though Peter was going through a period of mental illness, either temporarily or as the start of a much bigger issue. Reportedly, some from his university discovered writing all over his walls of his apartment. He'd written things like, "I'm not angry, I'm upset, and it's so crazy, it just might work." According to his attorney, Peter was experiencing mental illness, but he had no history of cruelty. Many people have been confused as to how this wasn't noticed by any of his friends or anyone at his college, but it really seems like nobody saw this coming. He was majoring in finance and mechanical engineering, and he was on the honor roll. His friends say that he was always smiling and committed to sports and staying athletic. So you can imagine when Peter was arrested for a double homicide and abduction, everyone who knew him was stunned beyond belief. Early on March 21st, 2020, Connecticut State Police were called out to a domestic disturbance in Willington, a small suburban town in Talon County. The scene they arrived at was more than a disturbance for sure. What they found was 62-year-old Theodore Ted Dimmers dead and covered in a very grisly state, and a neighbor with severe injuries to his hands. Both men had been stabbed with a samurai sword. After consulting witnesses, the police quickly named Peter as a suspect and began what would be a 6-day-long manhunt for him. Peter became a suspect due to information by Ted's wife, Cindy. The family of the neighbor, a young woman, Manfredonia mentioned later, told her that they had thought of getting a restraining order against him. He had allegedly visited their home before. According to the woman Peter was looking for, who's chosen not to reveal her name to the public, Peter was obsessed with samurai swords, and she'd wanted to get a restraining order since he tried to break into her social media accounts. Ted encountered Peter on the way to his barn, where he stored wood for his workshop. According to reports, Peter was walking through the street and told Ted that he knew one of their neighbors and his motorcycle had broken down not too far away. Ted offered to give Peter a ride back to his bike, and he accepted. Not long after they arrived at the location, Peter took a samurai sword out of his backpack and fatally injured Ted. The other neighbor, who was also injured, saw what was going on and rushed out to try to save Ted. Of course, there were huge concerns over the fact that Peter was clearly armed and dangerous. Many suspected he was on his way to kill the girl he'd been following, as is so often the awful result of unchecked stalking. Peter vanished from the scene and wouldn't be heard from again for several days until he struck for a second time. A few streets away from the Dimmers home, Peter broke into a house and stole a number of weapons, money, and food, as well as the homeowner's truck. Police found the homeowners, a 73-year-old man, tied to a chair in his basement, but otherwise unharmed. The man told police he'd been held captive by Peter for at least 24 hours before he took the man's weapons and vehicle. During that time, they watched TV and he tried to convince Peter to turn himself in. Peter told the man he didn't understand why he'd done what he did to Ted and seemed apologetic. However, he wasn't interested in turning himself into the police. Peter figured he'd have a good 2 weeks on the road before police eventually caught up with him. After leaving the house, he drove an hour away to Derby before abandoning the vehicle in a state park. Police had a pretty good good idea of where he was heading. Peter's high school friend, 23-year-old Nicholas Asseely, lived with his girlfriend in Derby. Police suspected that Nicholas may have been harboring Peter while he was on the run, but when they got to his house, the scene they walked in on told a different story. Nicholas was lying dead on the floor of his home. He'd been killed with one of the weapons Peter stole from the home he broke into. It was clear there'd been some kind of struggle, and Peter, along with Nicholas's girlfriend and the vehicle, were nowhere to be found. Just as they were about to put out an alert to the local police department, the state police got a word that Nicholas's girlfriend had already been found in Paterson, New Jersey. According to her, Peter had indeed visited the home and proceeded to kill Nicholas before making her get into the car with him. He drove them down to Paterson and abandoned Nicholas's girlfriend and the car, leaving the scene on foot. Why he drove to Paterson is a mystery, but authorities were just glad to find her alive. However, Peter's whereabouts were still unknown, and authorities became more concerned as it became obvious he was traveling to different states, which would slow down the investigation. After he abandoned Nicholas's girlfriend, Peter got an Uber to a Walmart in East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, over an hour away from Paterson. He was captured on a security surveillance camera, walking along a set of train tracks behind the store. In the days following that last sighting, he went completely off the radar. Peter's family hired an attorney, Mike Dolan, to represent their son, and that started with making sure he was found safely. During a press conference, Mike appealed to Peter and asked him to come home and turn himself in to the authorities. He didn't comply with his lawyer's wishes and instead kept traveling. The following day, he was thought to have stolen another vehicle in Pennsylvania, but where he went was unknown. Wherever he was headed, he was doing a pretty good job of keeping the police on their toes. The authorities finally managed to start catching up with Peter after he was spotted by a store clerk in Chambersburg, where he abandoned the stolen vehicle and got another Uber to Hagerstown, Maryland. It was there that he finally was captured by police and surrendered into custody without harming anyone else. So let's talk about what happened next, the social media response. Peter had a public Instagram account, now deactivated, and within days of his name hitting headlines, it was swarmed by admirers. I know in a couple cases we've mentioned this sort of thing before, but people that admire the criminals do it without really acknowledging what they've done. It's like they only focus on their looks and pretty much ignore the fact that they're like a literal murderer. This wasn't so much the case with Peter. Not only were people commenting on his appearance, but they were making jokes out of the crimes he'd been arrested for. Videos started to pop up on TikTok of people reading through the comments on his Instagram, and the stuff people were writing was super weird. Like, one user wrote, "You killed it in this pic, kill me next." What was even weirder was that for some unknown reason, people created a sort of fictional fandom for Peter. They somehow connected him to the queen of rap, Nicki Minaj, and controversial TikToker, Lovely Peaches. They would comment lyrics from Nicki's music on his photos, and some people even made fan accounts where they would Photoshop photos of Peter and Peaches together. Since these days it's not uncommon for murderers to have fan bases, the activity on Peter's account didn't go unnoticed. It was covered in numerous articles which seemed to only fuel the fire, until the Manfredonia family chose to remove his account and had some of the fan accounts deleted too. Since his arrest on May 27th, the media has been surprisingly quiet about the trial and what's going to happen next for Peter. This is probably the work of his attorney, Mike Dolan. In October 2020, it was reported that Peter was being held in police custody with a bail of $7 million, and he'd pleaded not guilty to all the charges brought against him. He was due to appear in court in November 2020, but I can't find a single update on the case since October. The most likely scenario is that the trial has been put on hold due to the current situation going on in the world. For now, at least we know he's somewhere where he can't hurt anybody else, and hopefully soon in the future, he'll be brought to justice. Until then, it would probably be a good idea to stay away from any social media posts about him. It looks like most of the weird fans scattered after Instagram got involved, but there's always a few stragglers trying to fuel the fire. So, what do you guys think of this case? What about his Instagram fan base? As always, I can't wait to see what you guys think down in the comment section below.